don't need this.
No, like it.
Okay. You. Good evening and thank you for joining us. Now, we have, of course, reduced the frequency of the number of live discussions we do because we want to be able to deliver real quality to our viewers. So we take a couple of days to put together the ideal panel of experts, the best possible voices on a subject, and then bring it to you. So this is what we've done today. My team has spent a couple of days putting together the best possible panel on this particular subject. And what is the subject we're discussing today? There is a report called the Global Gender Gap Report. Now, this is brought out by the World Economic Forum. And bad news, guys, this year, India has rated at 140 out of 156 countries. I'm going to take you through some of those details on why we believe this is so important. We have to have this discussion right now. Now, India has slipped 28 places in 1 year. We were ranked at 112 out of 153. We're currently 140 out of 153. It's really a race to the bottom at this point. We are among the worst performers in South Asia on this particular index. Now, let's take a look at what this index is. It basically maps the difference or the gap between men in the country. Now, before I go any further, I must point out that given the size of the country and the population of our country, obviously these challenges are much harder for India than they are for the other countries being considered. Nevertheless, India was always of this size. So our systems are built for this size, right? Let's take a look at where we lost out. First of all, women's labor force participation, which we knew was already slipping even before the COVID lockdown, got much, much worse during the lockdown. It fell from 24% participation down to 22%, 22.3%. The share of women in professional and technical roles also fell. The share of women in senior and managerial roles is very, very low. This is actually a statistic that really worries me. It says basically that women in India as income make 1/5 of the men in India. And that apparently really hurt us on this particular, index. Discrimination against women reflected in health and survival, where we did really badly. The gap in gender ratio at birth, which means that India is still using sex selective practices to make sure that people have more baby boys than they do baby girls. That's obviously generally depressing. Also, education attainment, there's a difference of 96.2%. Here's the sad thing. Among India's neighbors, and remember, we are at 140, Bangladesh rated at 65, Nepal was 106, Bhutan was 130, Sri Lanka was 116. The only two of our neighbors who did worse than us were Pakistan and Afghanistan at 153 and 156. So not great company that we're keeping here on this index right now. So we're among the worst performers in South Asia. And we really shouldn't be, because India has been working at this for decades and decades. So like I said, my team has put together some great voices of experts on this particular subject, people I respect greatly. Ms. Poonam Mutreja is the Executive Director at the Population Foundation of India, has dedicated decades of her work and effort towards improving the condition of women in this country. Ms. Ranjana Kumari is a women's rights activist and has also spent so much time on exactly the things that we're talking about. Ms. Nishita Satyam is the Deputy Country Representative of India, Bhutan, Maldives, Sri Lanka at the United Nations Women. So I'm really happy to have all three of you join us. Thank you so much for making time. My first question is to Ms. Mutreja. Good evening to you. Obviously, very, very disappointing. And this COVID year has cost us dearly. Why do you think this has happened? Was it that the gains that Indian women had made were not really gains? Or is the government not focusing on what women need? How did this happen? How did we go from 112 to 140 in 1 year?
Okay, so, India, I've always said in the context of COVID, and I want to stress that we had these gender gaps already existing. And the COVID situation clearly exposed the gender disparities, the inequality that women experience more. And data is coming out not only through this index, but there's a lot of information and data coming out that the COVID crisis exacerbated the situation in terms of the gender gap, and women fared very badly in the last 1 year, worse than they had fared here. But it was like an epidemic as far as women are concerned, whether it was sex ratios, whether it was violence, and so on. And in a way, I am very glad that we are having to face what I love what did you say, a race to go to the bottom. I mean, this race has to not only shame us into action, but really there is no further evidence, where people like Ranjana and Nishta and all of us have to scream, whether it is on television and everywhere else, that there is a huge gender gap. This has completely given us evidence how quickly the situation of women, it was bad, and how quickly it can get worse. Now, if we look at violence, women
Yes.
experienced interpersonal violence. 1 in 4, it's data we knew before. 1 in 4 women experience violence, interpersonal violence. But this, the COVID situation made it much worse because women were held captive with their perpetrators in the house. So it has actually exposed what we really are and the inequalities women experience. Then this increase in work, a lot more women losing their jobs, it and the workforce participation rates were going down. They were downward plunge, but it has got further exacerbated. And again, when there is a crisis, when there is a problem, or when there's a choice, it is women who have to leave the workforce. Either both. There's a pull factor and a push factor. Push factor being, if there are fewer jobs, then men will retain the jobs and women will be pushed out. Second is the pull factor, where women, the amount of work with children being at home, with male partners and others being at home, their caregiving role increases so much that they have to leave the workforce even if they had a job. I mean, I've had situations where 3 of my women colleagues, offered to resign because their caregiving role increased. And of course, we didn't let them, we made arrangements that they couldn't. And finally, I'd like to say that in terms of, during the crisis, I think it was thought that we will all be focusing on COVID so much that many of the other things will not be noticed. So even though we found out very quickly that violence against women had increased, their work stress had increased, young girls, access to sanitary pads, whichever way you look at, and girls were dropping out of school, the data started showing, the data, even if you looked at the HMIs, which is the health data for districts, you could see that the decline in women receiving women receiving reproductive health services, including opportunities to deliver in institutions, had increased within 3 months. But women were not considered a priority. Where will pregnant women go if we don't have facilities? Or if women are too scared to come, it was the role of the frontline health workers. But the frontline health workers, I mean, look at this. India's foundation of public health and dealing with the COVID crisis was women. It was frontline health workers. But those were the very people who could have helped women come to facilities or pushed for facilities to open, but they were asked to work full time. So women is not a priority. And how could we imagine those who are pregnant and those additional women who got pregnant, even though they did not wish to get pregnant because there wasn't access to family planning services. So nobody thought of women. So, I mean, we are very thoughtless. So this,
Effectively, Ms. Muthuja, you're saying that the people who were making decisions for the country at that time did not consider the implications of these decisions on women, or did not consider at any point planning for the alleviation of the pain that these decisions would cause to women.
well, I'd like to say that, but there were exceptions. I mean, it's very important. It's very easy. I am saying that in a way, but where I want to also have some good example, and I'm going to give it very quickly.
Please.
Some of us got together, women's reproductive health groups. We are part of a coalition. We wrote to the Prime Minister, the Health Minister, and the Health Secretary. I have to tell you that the Health Secretary was a woman that time, and additional secretary to a woman, Vandana Gurnani. And we were very pleased to see two women in this leadership position. It took them one day of receiving our letter and sending out instructions in the field that women's reproductive health services, including family, should be considered essential services, which is what the UN already had passed. WHO had already passed a resolution that this was a essential service. So we saw quick action when we had two women in leadership position in the health ministry. And it's important to mention that when we are criticizing. So I'm saying two things.
Thank you for that really fair assessment. Yes. Yes. And I'll come back to you. Let me just bring in Ranjana ji. Ranjana ji, there is obviously the argument that okay, it was a bad year because it was COVID. A lot of things didn't go as planned. A lot of things couldn't have been foreseen as well. We'll recover in the next couple of years. Is that possible? Can we recover what we've lost in the last 1 year?
Well, I think if we blame it to COVID, then we are overstretching the argument. Because when you look at the four different dimensions on which the report is basing itself on, then it is political representation and participation, it is health, it is education, and also employment and employment opportunity and economic opportunity. If you look at all the four, then we are not talking about just COVID. COVID did miss the gender lens completely. There is no gender lens to manage the COVID. Here and there, maybe some patchwork has been done. But when you look at the overall situation, then COVID really has not been managed, and neither the COVID recovery has been managed in the way even Asha Anganwadi workers, when we have been working with them, have not really been trained, not given even the basic minimum safety kit. So I think that's a very, very hurting story. But what this report is talking to us, all this data, what is this data telling us? This data is telling us that women, let me tell you what is going on here. 28 years we are waiting for a bill to be passed by the parliament, which will facilitate women's leadership at different levels of political representation. So political empowerment how will it happen? It will happen when women are given the political representation. But it's not just COVID period that we lost it. Now let's go to the health. Gender-based sex selection during this whole period, of course, has been completely, a kind of structure which is collapsing. There's hardly any monitoring going on. But even from before this, so many states have gone for this gender gap because of sex selective abortions, and they have really added to the problem. And when you look at the women's health, they start from a weak health as a child with the nutritional deficiency, and then look other data, MMR, maternal mortality rate. Then when you look at we are one of the lowest when you look at even close to sub-Saharan Africa. We have changed, we have improved a little bit, but still our maternal mortality is very, very low. I mean, like it's really so many women died during childbirth. Why in today's age and time? So it's not just that whatever happened is happening now, but it has been there for a long, long time. And now this has become worse. Children leaving entry into the school happened up to primary level, but retention was not planned. So dropout rates have been already high. And this period has really shown us the real picture, like a mirror in front of us, that if you don't build the capacity of the girl children to be retained in the school, then when it came to technology, it is the boys who got the technology, the girls did not. And so they also missed on education. Once they missed on education, child marriage increased. So, you look at all those data, and there is a connect between what is being happening. Okay, let me come to the labor force and economic opportunities. We already had a kind of 10% decline in the labor force. All the economic reports have been talking about it. But what did we do to plug it? I mean, there has not been, and then to add it, so many women have lost their job. The whole informal sector went completely, millions of women have got lost jobs, and they have not got it back even now. Some middle class and some white collar jobs have come back, but not to the informal sector women. The jobs have not come back to them. So this is all collectively is adding to our sliding down by 28 steps further down. And also, it's unfortunate that we keep comparing with our neighbors, but look at globally where we are. I mean, it's important to know Bangladesh, of course, is 65, as you rightly said. But what about the the other countries? Every other country in South Asia is better than us, including Nepal.
Yeah,
I mean, including Nepal. If I say Pakistan, everybody will be like, they're all better because they all decided, and in fact, Nepal decided to give women representation through their constitution. They really are.
Precisely the point. With your permission, I want to bring in Nishta Satyam as well, because her job involves looking at other countries in South Asia other than just India. What did they do differently, Nishta, that we didn't in the last 1 year, in the last decade or so, that has caused us to slip to this very worrying point?
Thanks, Faye. Thank you. I am indeed in the presence of very esteemed women who really spent all their life fighting for this. So I feel very underqualified to even be speaking with them. But honestly, let me give me a minute, please, because we must analyze the report for what it is. So first off, if you dwell deep into the report, it doesn't take into factor completely the impact of COVID-19. So the attribution that we may be making to COVID is an artificial attribution, number one, and is a possible correlation. The report exactly draws data the way it has been for years. There is no factoring in of what COVID might have done. So the regression that we are seeing is the regression that is minus COVID-19. So possibly we're talking about a situation that is much worse than what we are discussing right now. COVID has impacted families, communities, marketplaces, leadership in a way that that is going to take a much longer time. The report particularly does not reflect anywhere in the 5 parameters that they have analyzed us on or analyzed countries on in a way that is directly attributable to COVID-19. So that's number one.
1 second, sorry, forgive me for interrupting you, but if I read correctly, the first thing that this report says is that while we had assumed over a year ago that it would take 100 years to reach complete gender parity around the world, it's now going to be 130 odd years, and the extra 36 years have been added by COVID.
Absolutely.
Now that's the first paragraph. So doesn't that indicate that the entire
that does put the generation that the fact that gender equality is a generation further than it actually was. But when you look at the parameters, when you look at the index, here we're talking about slipping places on an index that comes out of 5 parameters. That may have coincided with COVID-19 when we look at tenure of that data, but it is not attributable to COVID-19 because
Nishta, just I need to draw your attention to, report talks about labor force participation rate from 24.8% to 22.3%. And it talks about gap Biden this year, 3%.
Correct.
So it does take that, COVID situation, it does.
Rajna, I'm making a different point. I'm essentially saying that there is a correlation. The time that COVID-19 has existed is the same as the time that the data was drawn, but the report doesn't particularly take into complete impact or into its entirety the impact of COVID-19, because COVID-19 has impacted many more parameters in many other ways that the report doesn't consider. So essentially, the sum and substance of my point is we're possibly looking at a worse off situation than what the report is reflecting at this point. If we were to look at, if we were look at how we've performed. Now, and I'll come to your question, Faye, which is what have countries done? And I think on your show and on every other show, I have always maintained that and India cannot be compared to a Sri Lanka, cannot be compared to a Bhutan, cannot be compared to a Norway. We are so uniquely placed, and if you were to analyze each of these parameters, there is a bright spot and there is a dark spot. For example, if we were to take political empowerment, which is where we have regressed the most, we have registered a decline of almost 13.5 percentage points. But it is also the time where we've had the highest representation of women in the Lok Sabha, but not particularly as ministers, not as women who are at the helm of decision making, so to speak. If you look at economic empowerment, there are many dark spots, but it also reflects on the fact that there are more women as skilled professionals, though there is a larger decline in women in technical roles. So I think it would be, India is such a paradox that it would be very difficult to compare any one country to India. But the one strategy that really needs to be focused on right now, which I think we've been talking since 1995, but have not particularly hit the nail on, is gender responsive budgeting. We could be talking about women-led empowerment. We could be talking about the Charter of Women-led Empowerment. But where is the transformative financing that is going to push the envelope of gender? And I think that's very important. It's very nice to discuss a report at this stage, but when we discuss our union budgets, where are the women? What are we funding? Because we do put our money behind things that matter. And the answer to that question is that the biggest gap between many other countries and us is funding structural barriers that need to change. And I completely 100% agree with Ranjana that there is no other way to go through this than political empowerment. It is the one short strategy that is probably going to bring women at the helm of decision making. So yes, we're a very progressively legislated and a very affirmatively legislated country, but we are way behind we're very ahead in conversation, we're very behind in action sometimes. And I think one of the prime strategies that I would pick for this conversation is transformative financing, is that envelope of funding for gender. Gender is the most spoken about agenda in the last 10 years, and at the same time, the most underfunded agenda of really the last decade and almost the last century. So I think bridging that gap is what will bridge the distance or the regression that we are seeing on paper today.
So let me just put this into perspective. Effectively, you're saying that we're talking about the Women's Reservation Bill that has now lapsed, will have to be reintroduced after 3 decades, ladies, of
2008 it was introduced, right?
Introduced, yeah. But the fight for it started a lot before that, before it even reached Parliament. Is that the silver bullet? Because the argument, if I understand correctly, is that we get a mandated number of women into Parliament, they will be able to influence more decisions. They will be able to put women at the forefront of budgeting, of planning, of execution of those plans, of auditing of the plans and the spending that the government is doing, which we're not doing enough of. Is that the silver bullet? Is that what we're waiting for? Because we have the schemes. We have a women and child ministry that is meant to, for whatever reason, if we consider women and child to be the same thing, but that's meant to be able to do this. Why is that not enough? Poonamji?
I believe it's very important to bring in the amendment and to make a women's reservation bill, but I don't believe it's a sufficient condition. It's necessary, but it is not sufficient. Even if we do reservation and we bring, like we did at the panchayat level, and women don't have power, authority, fiscal, Nishta referred to fiscal power for women. I don't believe only gender budgeting will solve, or putting money there. There has to be political commitment. We all saw the Nirbhay Fund. It's not a huge amount, but I'm sure it pains Ranjana, who also worked very hard on this, that we have a budget and it is not spent. And it is so, if you analyze and look at the small expenditures, 10% or 15% of the entire Nirbhay fund, it is used worthlessly. I mean, it is used for just campaigns, but just saying Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, or some districts bought gates. You know, how will gates help Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao? So we have to have a political commitment, and I do not believe that only women's reservation bill can solve the problem. Also, even if you have women in power, if they are going to behave like the men, or expected to behave or pushed to behave like men and not have agency and opportunity, it's not going to help. The reason 6 countries that did really well on COVID, which were headed by women, they were not just headed by women who were there because they're women. They were capable women who had the authority, ability, and agency. And as far as, I would like to also include China when we are talking about our neighbors. I'd like to say that it's not, I mean, in China, you don't have, of course, political power, democracy, anything, but they invested, like Sri Lanka, like Bhutan, they invested in public health, they invested in education, which is same situation as Kerala. And in India, people keep saying, don't compare Kerala to the rest of India. But because they invested in education, health, not everything was solved. My co-panelists know in Kerala, gender-based violence is unexpectedly high. But other things are better for women. There's greater equity, agency, empowerment, and even the Panchayat Raj is working much better than any other in terms of women's participation. So we need a bunch of things, but we need political commitment. And I do want to say here, this government has the best opportunity to show political commitment, especially to the reservation bill, because they don't need any other party to oppose them. And in any case, they pass whatever bill they want, regardless of what the other parties. So they have this tremendous opportunity, ability, track record, and capability of passing a bill tomorrow. So I would like to challenge the government to do that and show us. And, this is quite a slap in the face of India. Let's deal with the slap head on and bring in the reservation bill. Though I am saying, I still maintain that's not the only. We need to do other things. We need to be political. We need political commitment. We want participation. And on the whole, we have to create opportunities for women where they can be retained in the labor market, whether formal or informal. And we need to decrease and share and bring in some gender equality into sharing the caregiving role of whether it's children or it's aunts, uncles, in-laws, parents. And
I just want to take a minute to slay some misconceptions that pop up in our chat window. Kumara Kantirava has said that the most important problem is population control. Mother India cannot manage 140 crore children. Boss, stop calling it Mother India unless you're going to do a better job looking after the actual mothers in this country. 1. 2. For any government to assume that you can bring in a rule about population that's going to improve it in any way is shows that you have not read anything about the subject at all. There have been enough conversations we've done on this very YouTube channel that you can take a look at that prove statistically that the only way to improve all of the metrics that we're talking about, which is what Poonamji was just saying, is by educating the women. When women in India have access to education, they have access to family planning, they have access to agency over their own bodies, which is they're able to decide for themselves what they want to do. They always make the right decision. I'll say that slowly again. Women will always make the right decision if they're given access, education, and agency. That is what we need to be delivering, not bringing in more rules that men will make about how women should use their bodies. That is how we got ourselves into this mess to begin with. Ranjana ji, I just wanted you to pick up from where Poonam ji left off about the women's reservation bill and what that is likely to deliver. Because I remember when Kamala Harris was being sworn in as Vice President of the United States, a lot of gentlemen on Twitter wrote to the women in India saying, "What are you so happy about? We've already had had a woman president and a woman prime minister and many women chief ministers. So really, we're much better than they are. Why has that not helped us up till now?
It's not the question of head count. It's not the question of how many, because this report also talks about, what was in 2019, the number of ministers were 23%, and 2021, we have just 9%. 9.1% women ministers. Second thing is also the political representation and participation is one area where we have fallen the most. I mean, like that's where it really pulls us down. So regressed by 13.5%. So this is something where we have really come down. And this can be corrected by just one stroke of Parliament's decision, It's really, and also why it is important, because look at even we are talking about COVID and impact. Just a single directive coming from the Parliament, if they had the gender lens, saying that all the pregnant women will have the hospitalization facility, nobody can drive them and shoo them away, then we wouldn't have had migrant workers delivering children on the roadside, which made a huge international story. And also that which really showed the Indian, I think policymakers, their place in terms of what they are doing to women of India, in terms of their health. So every which way, if people, did we ever discuss why work participation rate of women is declining in the Parliament? Was there ever a kind of proper white paper presented, or whatever report presented to Parliament of India to discuss what is going on here? Why aren't women walking out of the workforce? Globally, women are joining the workforce and our women are walking out of the workforce. So what is going on here? I think this is why it is important that forum, that's the only forum that the country has where you can discuss, you can decide, you can allocate budget. Nishtha talked about gender budgeting. I know that we all collectively have been working for years and years, and also in some sense it does exist, but it doesn't have any kind of impact, because there is no impact assessment. There is no allocations are done just artificially, and those allocations do not really reach to women. Look at all the schemes of Government of India. They are supposed to be gender neutral schemes, but do we not know that when you really promote gender neutral schemes, women lose out, because nobody then goes to give them this, whether it is a Mahatma Gandhi Manrega program or whichever way of Pradhan Mantri, so many yojanas are there. One thing good that has happened very recently, and I think I'm happy that I participated in that discussion with the Women and Child Ministry, that they have now, after so many years, are talking about convergence. That's the, I think, the magic wand. When you start putting all different kinds of activity plans and policies and projects together and see a coordinated implementation, and then also the impact, and that is what through convergence they can achieve. And if that happens, I'm very happy that it will be then leading to better future for women. But certainly passing the bill to just once half a second, Faye, that passing
No. I'm going to ask you a question, and you can continue to answer it. The question is this, and it always pops up whenever we talk about the women's reservation bill. Our chat window is buzzing with, but then the women will just become fronts for their husbands, who will be basically puppet MPs or puppet MLAs. But we've seen a pattern emerge in the panchayats that have proved otherwise, right, Ranjani?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, like now the nationally studies have been conducted in every state about the impact of women joining the panchayats. And once women have that started understanding their role and their power, and that they can really improve the village situation, they can help farmers get more access to credit, they can improve the the irrigation, so many things that the women can do sitting in the panchayat. There certainly things have happened. I mean, local governance has become much stronger because of 50% of presence of women, and every study has concluded that. I mean, we are ourselves researchers, and we do a lot of this data collation and try to see what is going on at the grassroots level. But what is important to understand is that women missing from the positions of power at the top level really is not, really is missing. Not only missing, we are getting left behind. Just make that correction. If that course correction is made just by, whether you call it women reservation bill, because they will have to
we have a finance minister, which is arguably the third most important ministry in the country, defense of finance, who's a woman. Isn't that top management?
Well, I don't think, I'm going to say a very strong word, Faye, and that is ornamental presence does not really make any difference. Fine. Even in terms of your, we already know that how difficult for her it has been to manage the finance ministry and what is the condition of and health of the finance in the country at the moment. We are about to, sell all our major public sector companies. We are about to generate just to fulfill our deficit, just to cover up our deficit. We have to do so much of management of this finance. This is not, I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm nobody to judge like that, but certainly if you are not in critical numbers, certainly if you don't have the power to make the decision, independent decision. I know of strongest of women in this at the moment in the ruling dispensation have hardly any voice, because some of them are personal friends and some of them I'm seeing they're functioning also. So I have a feeling that this is not going to work. If government wants, as Poonam very rightly said, they can bring in, whether you want to call it reservation bill or not, whatever you want to call it, call Ram Sita bill or whatever you want to call that bill. But please give equal representation to women in every level of democratic institution and bodies everywhere. Whether it is education, whether it is bureaucracy, whether it is panchayat, we've got parliament and state assemblies. If you do that, then you see the change that will happen in terms of global perception of India and also India's performance about building women's leadership and capacity and changing the whole future course.
Let me just bring in Poonamji on that same point before I take a new question to Nishtha. Poonamji, do you agree that right now we have, unfortunately, ornamental presence of women at the upper ends of government, and it's not enough to show any real change?
I totally agree with Ranjana. We have not only ornamental situation, but we have a lot of very strong women in BJP, as Ranjana also said, who have no authority or agency at any level. And the few women who are ministers, certainly I would like to say that I have, given where she comes from, JNU, PhD, respected academic, I'm sure she has a lot to contribute. But in the finance ministry, whatever we have seen in the last 3-4 years, I am worried that a woman is going to be blamed. Ultimately, they'll say, oh, there was a woman in power of authority, but we know who's making the decisions and how the decisions are being made. Even today, the middle class has been so impacted. Look at, they're bringing down interest rates for something that the middle class uses, which is public provident fund and so many other areas. Everything is designed to reduce the fiscal whatever little opportunities people had, and to support the government in having more money to do what they want. And therefore, I am worried that Nirmala Sitharaman might, or a finance minister might just be might just put the women's agenda further behind because they'll blame her. But a lot of decisions are being made which don't make any economic or any other sense. And I would like to see more women. BJP has a lot of women, and I'd really like to see them in different places and authority, and having women more member of parliament, for me, who've come on their own steam, if they don't have the authority. And therefore, I totally agree with Ranjana. And all of us should be pushing, actually, it's not party, but we should be pushing any ruling party to put more women in position of power and authority. And this has given us an opportunity not only to push for the women's reservation bill, as this government has no excuse not to do something, but some of our lobbying and advocacy should be, without going into that this is BJP or Congress, it doesn't matter. We want to see more women within this party in position of power and authority, and not just ministers. We want to see them in other places having greater agency, say, and so on. We don't want them to be just spokespersons on television.
Well said. And I'll get the last question to Nishtha here. Nishtha, if you were to put down agenda points, and both Poonamji and Ranjana here very clearly said that it is it is about putting women in positions of power. Rachna ji acknowledged that it's about a sort of combined bird's eye view on making sure all of the schemes work together and they're being tracked together and they're being audited together. But if you were to put down a list of what needs to be done to achieve what you targeted with funding, gender-based funding, what would that be? What are the actual steps on the ground that need to be taken?
Oh, thanks, Faye. I completely agree. There is no, if there is one thing that doesn't have a shortcut in life, I think it's gender equality. It's not a vaccination. You can't put $50 billion and vaccinate everybody in the world. It doesn't work like that. It is not a linear issue. I think for me, the most important step, and I think there's complete consensus on the panel, is to bring more women into leadership. You cannot be for women without women. I think we've broken that barrier, we've passed that time. We can't continue like that any longer. So if we are talking about women-led development, it cannot be men talking about women-led development. It has to be women. And when we say women, I think we put one woman there and put so much onus on that one woman to change the world. We've had a conversation on this on your channel so many times about that critical mass. That critical mass is fundamental to voice, agency, and fraternity. And I think we must be aiming at that critical mass in positions of power, in places of power where decisions are being made. Second is investment. We cannot have women with no money in their hands to make that change. Investment is absolutely key. Our investment compared to any of our peers in education, in health, in gender is poor. It's also important on how we look at investment. When we look at investment, we're only talking about allocation to the Ministry of Women and Child Development. Let me remind you, 93% of the ministry's budget is for children. Is only 7% of that budget is for women. So what are we talking about? We need to look beyond allocation to a particular ministry and make women's issues only the issue of the Mahila Bal Vikas Mantralaya. We're talking about 50% of the population. Our concerns and our investment has to reflect that we're talking about 50% of the population of a country of 1.3 billion people, which means we're talking about all ministries, all departments. So, three, policymakers have to now give up on the concept of gender neutrality. There is nothing called gender neutrality. We have to move from gender neutrality to gender responsive. If we continue to make policies and make legislations thinking that this is gender neutral, we have to understand that any law that is not gender responsive is automatically bad for women and will widen inequalities. Something as small as COVID, the fact that gatherings were pushed to less than 50 people. We saw so many instances of rushed small marriages where women were not 18, were not of marriageable age, getting married. And also, the link that Ranjana ji spoke about, being out of school means an early marriage, and early marriage means an early pregnancy. We are talking about a life cycle approach. And it's important that policymakers now look at gender as a life cycle approach and not as an isolated approach. And I'm glad, and I'm had the opportunity to be on that meeting that Ranjana ji spoke about, where we are looking at convergence. But we've had a history of speaking about convergence and not particularly doing much about it. So maybe this time, if we look at convergence, we have to make that actual change because it's already too late. And the last, we've spoken a lot about women making that change. It's time that we look at top-down leadership also. It's important that this coalition is widened. And it's also important that we take this opportunity of the report, which shows India in bad light, as a challenge to make sure that we take the steps that can at least make us look better, and steps that are not difficult to take given the current constitution of the parliament. And Poonam is exactly right. There's nothing more that we need today to pass a bill on bringing more women in. And I think the fact that these conversations on women are going to be dummies is such a bogus conversation. If we only look at our own history, we know how baseless those conversations have been.
Sure.
Gender equality is not something that's going to happen overnight. It might take time, but there is no argument to not start on it with money, intent, political commitment, bureaucratic commitment, and of course, you cannot do it without women, and you must not do it without the civil society that has been on the history of making change in this country. So I think it is for me about coalition, collaboration, commitment, both political and financial.
Right. I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank my panelists. It always, makes me exceptionally happy when I have an all-women's panel, especially such qualified experts on the topic that we're discussing. So I'm pleased. Just a recap for our audience. India is currently 140 out of about 156 countries. With respect to the difference between men and women. It's not a great place to be. Doesn't show us in very good light to the rest of the world. And we obviously care about what the rest of the world thinks about us. But more importantly, that's half the country. And if half the country is doing badly, what do you expect in terms of GDP growth? What do you expect in terms of all of the wonderful development that we're hoping to achieve? We've done badly on almost every metrics over the last 1 year, specifically in the COVID year. But I just want to leave you with one idea. In India, it is not, it's not new to hear about the fact that girls are fed less than boys. The good stuff in the house, the ghee, the sugar, the jaggery goes to the boys, the girls eat later. This leads to girls who are anemic. Half of the women in our country are anemic, they're underweight. More girls are malnourished, more girls are undernourished than boys in our country. They are then pulled out of school, got married off early. They have babies early who are invariably also underweight, malnourished, and they don't have enough nutrition because the mom has no access to information, education, agency over herself. We also live in a country where raping your wife is not against the law. Hence, women don't have really a choice on what happens to them. We then give birth to another generation of babies who are underfed and are unable to compete because their brains are not going to grow fast enough and strong enough to compete with your kids. We will always have a large population that is then sentenced to a lifetime of poverty and a cycle that repeats itself. All we need to do is find a way to feed our girls and educate our girls. And in order to prioritize that, we need to have more women in parliament and more women in state assemblies. Now, putting that in a nutshell, hopefully, more people who make these decisions will understand that better. But to the ladies who joined us this evening, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the work that all three of you do towards improving the life of women in India. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.